Now the Dutch had a flair for architecture, and here they were building wood frame homes in Amsterdam, for instance, in the 1500s. I mean, there are houses there that are 400 years old, and these 400-year-old houses are still standing today. They were used to having houses packed together, and they called them townhouses, and so they were used to building these tall houses because land in Holland is at a premium. Because you remember, they're reclaiming that land from the sea. They're below sea level much of their country, especially Amsterdam. They have the canals that work through, and they have the dikes. And so because land was at a premium, they would build their buildings 4, 5 stories tall, out of wood frame, and they would do something really interesting. I thought things had settled, but then I looked around and I saw the buildings hadn't settled. They actually built them so that they were leaning out over the street. And the stairways were stairways were only 18 to 24 inches wide, so you couldn't carry furniture up, little narrow stairways. So and there was a beam that would come up much like at your barn. And so they would actually haul the furniture up and bring it through the windows. So the Dutch were used to creating these tall and of course, because they're in Europe and their architecture was more refined, more interesting structures. And they had these stepped gables that were common in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, but they were a lot of work to build. So they went to a sweeping curved gable. So the cape that the Dutch were building became the Dutch Colonial style, and then later this influenced what's called the Jacobean style, when you see that kind of stepping. So the Dutch Colonial, 1670 through 1760, 1680, we started to see the Dutch Colonials really emerging with style. And the innovation by the Dutch was to cantilever out their soffits so that the water would not be constantly pounding on the house. Then they straightened out their gable from their stepped gables, and in the early 1700s began using the gambrel roof, which added more space to the second story than they captured with just the dormers. Then they added dormers to the gambrel. Sweeping gable is something that's really typical of Dutch colonial architecture. If you look at a property and you see that sweeping gable, that's a real indicator that it's some sort of Dutch colonial or Dutch colonial revival. These Dutch colonials, they had a center entrance, 4 or 5 rooms on the first floor, and a large second story. These were very popular in Pennsylvania and also coming up through New York on the Hudson River because of all the stone along the Appalachian mountain chain and lots of granite in those states. The Dutch would use that stone on their first stories. And then there were many brick masons because brick and pottery and clay was something that they used a lot in Holland. Delft plates and very common building material. And because the clay was readily available from riverbanks, they fired it into brick. So by the early 1700s, they were building some pretty sophisticated homes in terms of a combination of stone and wood. Flaring eaves, that sweeping on the gable. Dutch doors was something else that became popular with that style. Double hung windows was an innovation that they brought to architecture and building here. And double hung windows came from their usage in their tight townhouse styles in Europe. You didn't get the ventilation that you might get if you had a house with 4 sides. So these townhouses next to the canals had these double hung windows. Now the double hung window was originally designed to be used so that the warm air went out the top and the cool air came in the bottom, so they'd get some ventilation. So that's an innovation that they brought to architecture here in America, was the double hung window. Early glass in America was actually blown into large oblong bulbs almost, and then cut into pieces, small diamonds. There was a great revival in the Dutch colonial styles in the 1900s through 1930.